What is the spirit of the philosophy of freedom? In 1894, Rudolf Steiner's The Philosophy of Freedom was published. A chapter titled The Goal of Knowledge was chapter 1 in the original 1894 edition of The Philosophy of Freedom. In 1918, the book was revised, and The Goal of Knowledge was placed in the back of the book. Here you can see from the original contents, Chapter 1 is the goal of knowledge. Today, if you have a revised edition of the Philosophy of Freedom, Chapter 1 will be conscious human action. We're interested in the goal of knowledge because it expresses the mood of thought, the attitude or spirit of the Philosophy of Freedom. Rudolf Steiner said, "It gives the mood of thought out of which I wrote the book." Here I'm looking at the spirit, meaning the attitude, the mood, the animating force or principle or the essential nature that permeates the philosophy of freedom. So we can look to the goal of knowledge to learn about the spirit of the philosophy of freedom. The world outlook of the goal of knowledge is anthropomorphism. This is part of a system of worldviews that Steiner came up with, where there's 23 ways of conceiving the world, 23 world conceptions. The first one is anthropomorphism. Then there's 3 tones, 7 moods, and 12 worldviews. I'm not going to get into that now, but I wanted to mention it because I want to talk about anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism. A widespread anthropomorphism rises in the world, taking all the worldviews to some extent, restrict oneself only to what one can experience on or around or in yourself, only what you can find within oneself. So this is another indication or description of the spirit of the philosophy of freedom, to restrict oneself only to what you can experience on or around or in yourself, only what one can find within oneself. The philosophy of freedom is a description of the path of Rudolf Steiner. It's a description of all of his experiences on that path. It's a description of his cognitive experiences and his experiences in the world. Here's a chart showing the various world conceptions. We begin with anthropomorphism here in the preface, and that moves out to the 3 tones of intuitionism, theism, and naturalism, which includes the preface and part 1 of theory and part 2 of reality. And then this goes out to the 7 chapter moods. The 7 moods are an approach to knowledge. Then each chapter breaks down into 12 worldviews. It begins with an introduction from one of the 7 moods, and then from there follows with 12 worldviews of different views on each of the chapter topic. Next, cult of individuality. The cult of individuality was a topic of the time, and it had to do that not that each individual is unique, but that the uniqueness of individuality can be cultivated. So you could call it the cultivation of individuality. This is a major part of the spirit of the philosophy of freedom, is the cultivation of individuality. The original edition of the philosophy of freedom, The Goal of Knowledge, begins with the cult of individuality. In the opening sentence, I believe I am right in pointing out one of the fundamental characteristics of our age when I say that, at the present day, all human interests tend to center in the cult of individuality. So here it shows you the prominence of this spirit, in that in the opening sentence, the first sentence that you come across when you read the Philosophy of Freedom in the original edition, is the cult of individuality. Steiner is linking the philosophy of freedom in with the times of our age, which he considers the cultivation of individuality a key interest of our age. So here in the first sentence of the philosophy of freedom, he's tying in the philosophy of freedom with what he considers the interests of the age. Rudolf Steiner, the individualist anarchist. Here's another indication of the spirit of the philosophy of freedom and Rudolf Steiner's spirit. In 1898, Steiner said, "Whether the term individualist anarchist is applicable to me, I would have to answer with an unconditioned yes." Now, this is very unusual for Rudolf Steiner to label himself with an ism. He's of the mind not to do that, to consider himself a free being that isn't going to be able to be labeled into a particular ism to describe who he is. So this is very unusual that he comes out and accepts the label and the ism of individualist anarchist with an unconditional yes. So what does it mean to be an individualist anarchist? The common anarchism meaning of today is the practice of extreme resistance or violence against government. This is not an appropriate meaning for an ethical individualist, because the ethical individualist practices moral technique, which is the ability to learn skills in order to transform the world according to one's ethical imaginations without violating the natural laws by which things are connected. So an ethical individualist has no interest in creating chaos, has no interest in tearing down the establishment, disrupting things. The ethical individualist learns skills, which is the technique to transform the world according to one's imaginations without undue harm. Individualist anarchism is, in a sense, the cultivation of individuality, which continues that theme of the spirit of the philosophy of freedom. Here's the definition of individualist anarchism: a nonviolent form of anarchism that emphasizes the individual and their will over external determinants such as groups, society, traditions, and ideological systems. I mean, you could call this a definition of the philosophy of freedom. Throughout the philosophy of freedom, there are inner and outer determinants that want to determine your thinking, want to determine your will, and the philosophy of freedom discusses overcoming these external determinants to become self-determined through the development of a strong will and the ability to become empowered enough to have more inner strength to overcome the external causes that are pushing you in one way, one direction or another. Emphasizes the individual and their will over external determinants. The philosophy of freedom was likely intended to be the anarchist Bible. I know an anthropomorphist who has referred to the philosophy of freedom in this way, with this title, the Anarchist Bible. And if you look at those times, Rudolf Steiner had drawn very close to the individualist anarchists, and I think he wanted to give them a Bible to kind of steer them in the right way, because this is something Steiner tended to do. He tended to get involved in a particular movement and then try to lay out a framework for the people in that movement to make sure and to help them stay on the right course. Now, individualist anarchism was a movement in Europe. European individualist anarchism emphasized defiance of social conformity. This philosophy was found among artists, intellectuals, and the well-read. The young Rudolf Steiner enjoys hanging out with the anarchist crowd. Biographer Gary Lachman writes, Steiner seems to have enjoyed hanging out with the bohemians. His acquaintances included poets, playwrights, novelists, and political activists. In fact, his reputation among people considered to be on the fringes of respectable society caused academics to cancel their subscriptions to his magazine, and Steiner also earned the distinction of having a periodical banned in Tsarist Russia because its editor was known to socialize with anarchists. The Philosophy of Freedom was also banned. The opening paragraph of the Philosophy of Freedom, in the Goal of Knowledge, is a description of the life of an individualist anarchist, and it has the principles for the cultivation of individuality. In the first paragraph, we see shake off authority, individual validation, nothing is valid unless it's validated by the individual, self-development, leaderless striving. Each person should select their own ideals. Each person has an inner worthiness, nonconformity. The objective of the group is the unique perfection of each. When it comes to what we do in the world, each person has a unique contribution to make. Free creative expression, striving for freedom, and independence, not to be dependent on anything. Rudolf Steiner became an owner, editor, and writer for the Magazine for Literature. And Rudolf Steiner said, everything I wrote for the magazine is imbued with the spirit of the Philosophy of Freedom. So here we can learn more about the spirit of the Philosophy of Freedom by what went on with his magazine. What did Steiner write about? Now, Rudolf Steiner showed courage in his magazine, and then he wrote and published to the world controversial magazine articles. He stood up and spoke his truth to the world. That's why he got involved with this magazine. After he wrote The Philosophy of Freedom, he wanted to convince people to take up its ideas. So he thought the best way to do that was to go into the magazine business and publish things out of the spirit of the Philosophy of Freedom. So he started getting in trouble when he published a letter. He published his correspondence with individualist anarchist leader and writer John Henry Mackay, where Steiner declares himself an individualist anarchist. Here's another article, Catholicism and Progress. Steiner defends the right of free thinking to question Christian truths revealed by divine revelation. And then he wrote, The Desire of the Jews for Palestine, where Steiner calls the Zionist movement an enemy of Judaism and says that accusing people of anti-Semitism causes division between Jew and non-Jew. Steiner criticizes the Theosophists and the Spiritualists for waging war on science and mocks their claims of inner spiritual experience. One of the things about having the spirit to speak your truth are consequences. And Steiner suffered the consequences of speaking truth. Steiner was accused of socializing with anarchists. The materialist Russian Marxist anarchists had turned to violence, ruining the reputation of peaceful anarchists. Magazine subscriptions were canceled, and the Philosophy of Freedom was banned in Russia. Steiner was very concerned about these attacks. Steiner warned individualist anarchist writer Mackay that the government may take action against individualist anarchist writers. That was including Rudolf Steiner himself for writing The Philosophy of Freedom. He was concerned that they may all end up in jail. Just a year after publicly declaring himself an individualist anarchist, Steiner abandons the Philosophy of Freedom and begins lecturing to a new audience, the Theosophists. Theosophy was a popular trending movement at that time. He accepted a job offer to lead the Berlin Theosophical Society, only on the condition he would work alongside a woman who he later married. Rudolf Steiner needed a job at the time. He needed money like everybody else. So this opportunity came up for a job with the Theosophical Society, who he had begun doing lectures for. And he took it on with certain conditions. One of them was that he had a crush on a woman who he later married, and he wanted to work with her, and he would take the job if he could work with her. In 1918, a revised edition of the Philosophy of Freedom was published. The Goal of Knowledge chapter is placed at the back of the new edition, and the opening individualist anarchist paragraph is completely deleted. The paragraph of those principles that I described earlier is completely gone, which shows you, because that particular paragraph was really a description of individualist anarchism. So he completely removed it, because even in 1918, which is 18, 19 years later from when this all happened, he was still concerned about it and wanted to remove that clear connection to individualist anarchism in the new book. So this really had a traumatic effect on him when he was attacked for being an individualist anarchist. In 1920, he came out to say Marx is the exact opposite of the philosophy of freedom. Said, I very much wanted my philosophy of freedom to sound a clarion call for the exact opposite of what we see happening today, which was the Marx-inspired violent socialist revolution in Russia. It makes it absolutely necessary for us in our future efforts to recognize that the social order must be built in a way that is made possible only by free thinking and by social trust. Today, we have Marxist ideas resurfacing, as they seem to continually do. An example is this idea of equality of outcome, which is a threat to social trust. Equality of outcome is to award positions according to groups, race, gender, and so forth. And it's also advocates for the equal distribution of wealth. In order to do this, it would take a tremendous authoritarian force, which then breaks down the social trust. And of course, we see all the censorship attacking free thinking today. So today we see the opposite of the spirit of the philosophy of freedom in group identity, victimhood, refusal to take responsibility, unearned merit, this materialistic externalism, collectivism, cultural conformity, censorship, political authoritarianism with all these COVID mandates, and the socialist communist ideology creeping up again. So I just wanted to go over the spirit of the philosophy of freedom, which lived in Rudolf Steiner and expressed itself in what he did. And it lives in many others today. Here's how you can identify that spirit of the philosophy of freedom. Steiner considered it the appropriate spirit for our age.